So this is the first talk of the 2014 year. Last week we were iced out of MABA or iced in, depending on where we were. So it is good to begin the new year after the retreat season to talk about the 3 Dharma seals. So this is an important teaching that underlies the Buddhist way of observing the world, how we pay attention to what it is that we experience, both internally and externally. So these 3 Dharma seals, or we can also say 4 Dharma seals, depending upon whether we're talking from the original teachings or from the Mahayana tradition. The first of these Dharma seals is impermanence, Anicca, wúcháng. So impermanence, to understand impermanence more deeply, is what we will see if we can look at today. The second of the 3 Dharma seals in the original teaching is unsatisfactoriness, Dukkha, who. The third is no self, Anattā or Anattā. These 3 elements are found in every one of the Buddhist teachings. And if you see a teaching that contradicts these 3 elements, then we know that it is not of the true Buddha teaching. So these 3 Dharma seals are very important in understanding how to look at the world, both internally and externally. So perceiving impermanence, bhikkhus, the Buddha said, developed and frequently practiced, removes all sensual passion, removes all passion for material existence, removes all passion from becoming, removes all ignorance, removes and abolishes all conceit of I am. Just as in the autumn a farmer plowing with a large plow cuts through all the spreading rootlets as he plows, in the same way bhikkhus, the perceiving of impermanence developed and frequently practiced, removes all sensual passion, etc., removes and abolishes all conceit of I am. So here the Buddha is likening the practice of impermanence to the plowing and the autumn, of breaking up all of the rootlets. The rootlets in this case could also be related to the afflictions, and all the way to the deep affliction of the conceit of I am, and connecting all the way to no self. So this is the way that the Buddha talks about Anicca. He also says the 5 aggregates, monks, are Anicca, are impermanent. Whatever is impermanent, that Dukkha, unsatisfactory. Wherever there is Dukkha, that is without also self. What is without self, that is not mine, that is not I am, that is not myself. This should be seen by perfect wisdom, samapanya, as it really is. Who sees by perfect wisdom as it really is his mind, not grasping, is from the taints, from the leaks, from the deepest roots of affliction. And he is liberated. So this is how important the practice of impermanence is, and how it's connected to the aggregates, the sankhara. So aggregates, we will see, have 5 components when it comes to sentient beings. We have form, we have feelings, we have perceptions and conceptions, we have mental formations, that habit energy. We also have consciousness, and all of those are impermanent, as the Buddha teaches. And when we can see this impermanence, when we can penetrate into the impermanence, this is called vipassana. This is the insight into how it is that all things are composed things, all compounded things are impermanent. I stopped myself here because I have this tendency to say all things are impermanent, but in fact, technically that's not exactly true, as we'll see. Not all things are impermanent. All composed things, compounded things, conditioned things are impermanent. Those things that are made up of the aggregates are all impermanent. So all this form, even though this table may not have feeling or consciousness, it's still form. It's made up of smaller and smaller elements of form, atoms, subatomic particles. So this table is impermanent. So it is with our bodies. We know that our bodies are impermanent. So this is true of our feelings, all of our thoughts, all of our habit energy, and even our consciousness, all impermanent. This is what the Buddha teaches. So the Buddha makes a distinction between what's called the uninstructed worldling and what is called the noble disciple. So the uninstructed worldling, puthajjana, ishan, this means a person that is actually the root in the Vedic language is a piece of flat corn, meaning something that's young, that's just beginning to grow. So it's very immature. In psychological terms, we use the word inchoate, means it's just like an embryo, just beginning to mature. So this is the uninstructed person, not yet mature in their practice. Whereas the noble disciple, and there are several different words. One is the Sutava Arya Savako. This is Sutta meaning, or Sutava meaning a learned person. Arya is noble, and Savako means well-practiced in this case. So this is a well-practiced, learned person, noble, able to sustain the right view. Jian Dao Zhi, able to attain to the right view. So this is the distinction that's made. So the person who understands impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and no self attains to the right view and is capable then of seeing how dispassion is the correct way of cutting oneself off from this world of suffering. The Buddha says the instructed noble disciples, seeing thus, becomes dispassionate toward the material world, feeling, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. Through dispassion, he is detached. Through detachment, he is liberated. In liberation, in knowledge comes to be that he is liberated and understands, destroyed his birth, lived the life of purity, do what needs to be done. There is no more of this to come and go. No more becoming or rebirth. So the illusion that takes place for the uninstructed person is that they believe that there are such things as permanence and satisfaction that comes from the sense world, and that they have a very strong sense of themselves, and they take many things personally. Even in my field of cognitive therapy, now there are people doing research on what causes people to be unhappy. And they have discovered that there are 3 very big causes of unhappiness. One is when people take events as permanent. 2, when they take events as having to have high levels of satisfaction. And 3, when they attach to it with their own ego person. Right? So this is straightforward cognitive therapy. So if we want not to suffer so much, we have to understand from the scientific point of view that letting go of permanence is very important. So what are these 3 illusions that the Buddha refers to? He says, permanence in the impermanent, satisfactoriness in the unsatisfactory, self in what is not self. He thinks and views in the same erroneous manner, and in each illusion, this leads a man astray, clouds his vision, and confuses him. So we need to see if this kind of impermanence that the Buddha is talking about is similar to or the same as other people, other teachers. So around the same time as the Buddha, just a little bit after him, in 535 BC, there was born in Greece a philosopher. His name was Heraclitus. And Heraclitus said, everything is change. Nothing is unchanging. Change and movement. This is the Lord of the universe. Everything is in a state of becoming, continual flux. You cannot step into the same river twice. The fresh waters are ever flowing upon you. As soon as you step into the water, it's not the same water. So this is Heraclitus' view. So he talked very much about change. The Buddha's view of change is not exactly the same as Heraclitus. So we'll see. Because the Buddha is specific about how change is part of a bigger cycle of arising, and abiding, ceasing, and dissolving. So he talks about how this change is part of a great cycle. In the original discourse in the story of the Buddha's passing, there is a discourse and a teaching bequeathed by the Buddha, in which the very last words of the Buddha are written down in this text. Very, very interesting words that are used here. I'll give you the Pali, the main line that I want to talk about. It goes like this: Vaya Dhamma Sankara. So the entire verse is, listen, all, O bhikkhus, I exhort you, I implore you, all compounded things are subject to decay. And he says, with heedfulness strive on. So this verse, Vaya Dhamma Sankara, does not contain the term Anicca, which one would expect here. Impermanence, all composed things are impermanent. Instead, the terms here are Vaya, which means loss or decay, Dhamma, which relates to all phenomena, all composed things, and Sankara, which means compounded or composed subject to conditions. So what he's saying is all composed things are subject to decay. So it's not just impermanence, it also means that the impermanence is directed towards something. There's an order. Just like physicists and mathematicians study the order of things, how things are organized, here the Buddha is talking about how things are organized. Otherwise, if everything was just change, it could be disorganized, and then you wouldn't have to study it. It would make no sense. So the Buddha said, Vaya Dhamma Sankara. He didn't say Anicca Dhamma Sankara. Because he was talking about how our 5 parts of the sentient being, of form, feeling, perception, conceptions, mental formations, and consciousness, how these are all going towards decay. In the Diamond Sutra, in the Mahayana text, you find a very important verse in chapter 32 that is emphasized when we read it in the chanting book. It's indented. Iche Yowe Fa, Umang Wampa Yi, continues on. This refers to all composed things. Iche Yowe. All composed things are like a dream, a phantom, a bubble, a shadow, a drop of dew, a flash of lightning. This is how to meditate on them. This is how to observe them. Here we're talking about the importance of how the mind views things so that we don't attach to them as being permanent. So, I had said before that not all things are impermanent. Only those things that are composed, made up of aggregates. So reality is made up of both what is conditioned and what is unconditioned. What is composed of aggregates and what is not composed of aggregates. This is very good to understand because otherwise, if we took the position that everything was impermanent, then we would have a dogma. We would say, this is how it is. But in fact, the Buddha is saying there's more to the picture than what we can see. So it's not often that we have the opportunity to look at what the Buddha meant by what is unconditioned. So I thought that today, since we're beginning the new year, not only would I talk about what is conditioned, but a little bit about what is unconditioned. This is a little deeper understanding. So bear with me here. Fortunately, we only have a few more minutes and it won't be too painful. Before I say this, let me tell a little story. The first is an ancient story about Huineng. Huineng was the famous monk, the 6th patriarch of the Zen tradition, Chan tradition, so important in the founding of the schools of meditation. And from Huineng, there were many, many great teachers that came forth. He was very influential and very helpful in spreading the Dharma. So there's a story about Huineng, and he's walking along the road and he comes upon two students that are arguing with each other. And one of the monks is saying, look at the flag is moving. The other monk is saying, no, the flag is not moving, the wind is moving. And they're having this argument, and Huineng comes upon them and he listens to them for a moment, and then he says, not the flag, not the wind. The mind is moving. He walks on. This is a very famous riddle. Koan. If you understand this koan, this is very good. If you don't, okay, no problem. Another little story that I'll tell you. Usually, I don't tell the story with the master here, but I'll tell the story with the master here. You may have heard the story about how one day, you know, the Chinese for impermanence is wúcháng. So one day, the master had just, with all of the helpers, they had just finished building the monk house. And people were around and they were planting some seeds and some trees. And the master was standing and looking at the building. And I went over to master and I said, excuse me, master, it's falling down. And he said, oh, Don Shushu, where is it falling down? I'll get a ladder and I'll fix it. And I said, oh, no, master, the whole building is falling down. And he said, oh, how long will it last? I said, oh, maybe 300, 400 years. He said, oh, no, wúcháng, wúcháng. This is an important principle. So, in the earlier tradition, unconditioned phenomenon was called wu wei fa. This wu wei is actually a term that is used a lot in Taoism also. It means doing without doing. Fa is the Dharma, the all conditioned experience. So, empty space, this is one of the unconditioned phenomena. So we'll talk a little bit more about empty space and what empty space means. And then there are two other, in the early Sarvastivada tradition, there are two other unconditioned phenomena. Both of them are related to nirvana. One is the way in which the afflictions are ended through analysis. So it's called the analytical cessation of the contamination of the afflictions. It's a lot of words. And then there's the non-analytical or effortless sensation. So both of them are related to sensation. So this is all there is that is unconditioned. Everything else is conditioned. So two different methods of understanding nirvana and empty space. That's really all there is. So, without going into too much detail. Okay. So in the Yogacara tradition, however, there are 6 kinds of unconditioned phenomenon. We We have the empty space, the destruction of the afflictions through analysis, and the destruction without analysis. So those three are the same. And then three more. One which can be described as motionlessness or undisturbed, which is related to the attainment of the fourth level of concentration. So in other words, when the mind enters the fourth jhana, the fourth level of high concentration, then the mind becomes motionless, and this too is now an unconditioned state. And then there's a concentration of the cessation of the sensation of perception. That's again a high level of absorption into the formless realm. And then what's called thusness as unconditioned, or suchness, which is the direct perception of experience without conceptions. So these are kind of technical terminologies in Yogacara. Yogacara, remember, has a lot to do with our practice. Mindfulness practice, meditation, practice of concentration, talking about how to attain those different states, so they add these other elements that have to do with the steps to reach liberation. And thusness or suchness, that's connected to the term Tathagata, the state of consciousness that the Buddha is in how it is that he perceives the world differently than people who are uninstructed and who are still trying to gain liberation. That direct apprehension of reality without the conceptions that cloud the mind. Then this is the highest level. So these are unconditioned phenomena. So we can say that really we can divide it pretty much into two kinds of phenomena. One being space, and the other being these different levels that are related to liberation. And the liberation itself and the apprehension of reality through liberation is unconditioned. So empty space actually has some different qualities to it, again, from understanding the Yogacara tradition. The empty space is not specifically related to space as we would look out into the outer, into the heavens or something like that. This space that they're talking about is a mental phenomenon. It's the absence of hindrances. So when spaciousness occurs, when there are no hindrances in the mind. So phenomenon is differentiated and limited and apprehended by our sight. This is conditioned. But when the mind knows none of these boundaries, no longer separated because of the various hindrances, then the mind is able to apprehend and understand spaciousness. So many times the description that people give when they're talking about entering into a deeper state of awareness is that the mind is no longer cluttered by so much chattering, so many feelings, so much habit energy. The mind suddenly becomes open and spacious when they talk about this experience in the teachings. So this is a into too much of a technical explanation. I said that there were 4 Dharma seals in the Mahayana tradition, the 3: impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, no self, and then nirvana. So nirvana is an unconditioned state, but it's still part of the Dharma seals. So any of the teachings that would invalidate the ability that we have to attain nirvana, this would not be part of the Buddhist teachings. In addition to this, through the 3 Dharma seals, there's also what is called in the Chan tradition 3 gates of liberation. If I can do this in Chinese or not. San Jie To Man. Someone can help me with this.
San Jie To Man.
Thank you. So these 3 gates of liberation include the first one being emptiness, the second being signlessness, the third being wishlessness. These are sometimes called aimlessness. So what does this mean? In emptiness, this would include the non-substantiality. This would include the notion that of the 3 Dharma seals. Signlessness means that as we perceive reality, we begin to recognize that our perception, particularly as human beings, we're so dependent on words and images to represent what it is that we're talking about, what we're thinking about, what we're experiencing, that what we experience gets overlaid many, many times over by our concepts. And that the concepts then begin to influence our perceptions, so that when we see things, these things are seen through a lens of what is called imputation or superimposition. So our experience of this table is not just the table anymore, it's also all of the concepts that we put onto the table. So there are many signs that we then, are characteristics that we put onto these things. This creates a distinction that leads to preferences, that leads to dissatisfaction. I would like a better table. Maybe I could talk to Tiger, he could make a better table. The distinctions start coming into the mind. And then all kinds of wishes and desires take place, so we begin to create goals that are specifically related to satisfying our sense-based desires. So to enter the gate of liberation is to be able to let go of all of these preferences, all of these desires and wishes, all of this concept of who we are, the self. This is not easy to do. Thich Nhat Hanh says of this, that the Buddha spoke of the 3 doors of liberation, considered 3 concentrations of emptiness, signlessness, and aimlessness. Emptiness is not a philosophy, it's a description of reality. Emptiness is a practice. Emptiness does not mean non-being or non-existence. There's a big difference between non-existence and emptiness. Suppose we look at a glass. Is it empty? The glass is empty, but it's not empty in a non-existent way. In order to be empty, you have to be there. That's one thing you can learn. Emptiness is not non-existence. The second thing is when we say that the glass is empty, you have to ask, empty of what? It's not empty of air, it's just empty of tea. But it's full of air. So the intelligent question is to ask, empty of what? The first answer may be empty of separate existence, empty of a separate self. So the sense of interconnectedness is what Thich Nhat Hanh talks about in many of his writings. That emptiness means that we're all interconnected. So this is a very valuable teaching of understanding a little bit about that. Signless is the second door of liberation. Sign means the appearance or the form. We're used to seeing the form that is the object of our perception. The practice is not to be attached to the form. This needs some training. Those of us who have lost a loved one, we know grief. But if you're equipped with the concentration of signlessness, formlessness, you can overcome your grief and your sorrow very quickly. You're capable of seeing things in the light of signlessness. Nothing is born, nothing dies, everything continues in a new form. Your nature is the nature of deathlessness. So signlessness here, Thich Nhat Hanh is talking about, is to see more clearly into the impermanence of things. Aimlessness is the third door. It means you don't put anything in front of you as the object of your pursuit. What you're looking for is already there, not outside of you. So these are the practices of the three gates. So when we practice, for example, bringing this to our practice, when we practice and we pay attention to our breathing, we notice that there is a moment that the breath arises, but it doesn't just continue to arise. That would be a permanent arising. It doesn't happen. After a while, we've reached the point where our breath we've taken in enough. Then the breath abides for a while. This abiding, we don't feel it, but the oxygen goes through our body and reaches every cell, and every cell is involved in this respiration process of the Krebs cycle. It takes our oxygen and combines it with the glucose, and it makes ATP that fuels our cells, keeps us going. But then this is not permanent either. It changes again. And then eventually the cycle ceases. We exhale, and it ceases. So in every moment of our breathing, we can see the arising, the abiding, the changing, and the ceasing. And this is a good way, I found, to begin my practice, because there are lots of concepts and things going on in my mind, and lots of chatter. So I want to calm my chatter down. So when I begin to practice, I will use this cycle, this 4-stage cycle, and then I make it simpler by just saying, observing, accepting, and letting go. And I do breaths in that way, and then eventually just rising and ceasing, and then letting go even of the concept of rising and ceasing, just observing it and letting it go without the words. So this is a good practice that we can do when we begin to do our breathing meditation. Breathing meditation is all about impermanence. Very, very helpful to see that. So one more thing that I will just say and maybe leave for another Dharma talk, because the word for change in Chinese, there are two words, and they both have the same pronunciation, yi. So in the Taoist, in the early Chinese, even before Taoism, in the 13th centuries BCE, there was a book called the Book of Changes, the I Ching. And that Chinese character I is a picture of the sun on top of the moon. But it also has two other meanings. Another meaning is a picture of a lizard who changes his shape and changes his color to fit in. So that's another kind of change. And it's also a picture of a flag. Etymologically, the history of the word, and the flag is moving. So that's another kind of change. But the I that's used in Buddhism is a different I. It's a picture of a table upon which two hands are pushing the material world aside. Dispassion. Different type of I. So that's a talk for another time. So when you see the flag, you may argue, oh, is the flag moving? Is the wind moving? Remember, Hui Nong, not the flag, not the wind, the mind is moving. May all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all beings never be separated from the altruistic joy which is free from suffering. And may all beings dwell in the great equanimity which is free from attachment, aversion,